This meeting is being recorded.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this Sutton Trust webinar that we've got today. I am both delighted and fascinated and honoured that the Sutton Trust have asked me to be your host today. I'm going to try and stay out of the debate as much as possible because we have actual experts here who are going to discuss the wider issues. But if anyone does follow my work, they would know that childcare is an obsession for me. It has been since about 2015 when I had my first child and realized how absolutely insane the system is in this country. And as a journalist, I have only seen it kind of become increasingly important and increasingly fraught in the preceding 8 years. Obviously, it's an election year. We have a huge change in policy coming in. There is a lot of different issues with that, which we'll explore today. We're going to start off with a bit of an introduction, 5 minutes from each of our panelists. And then we're going to go into a more open debate, and there will be plenty of time for people to ask questions. I know there will be lots of people on this call who have a lot of experience and expertise that they will want to share. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over first to Jonathan Simons. He's the Head of Education at Public First. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me. So I just wanted to make a few introductory remarks, particularly from the frame of the political environment and the party political environment. As Lexi said, it's an election year. And one of the interesting things is that childcare and early years education, and those two are not the same, but let's bracket them together for the minute, is actually probably, I would say, the preeminent education debate within the political framing at the moment. And on a cross-party basis, I think the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and to a slightly lesser extent the Liberal Democrats, are all talking about childcare and early years education as a priority. And that is not to be underestimated, and it should be remarked upon, because of course it was as late as 1997 that, of course, when the new Labour government came in talking about a significant expansion through Sure Start, it was only as late as 1997 that the dominant view was that early years education and childcare was not a subject for central government. It was not a subject for central government funding or for central government regulation. And indeed, this sort of creeping welfarism, as it was dubbed by some in 1997, of the extension of the state's remit into any education under fives, was seen as a kind of a very quite significant shift. You know, not wholly unlike the shift towards kind of universal primary and secondary education in 1944. So only 20 years ago, the fact that the government would even have any kind of locus on early years education and childcare was itself very, very contested. And here we are, 27 years later, with the two main parties competing over who can make the most attractive offer in this space. So that does show in many ways how far we've come. The interesting thing, of course, though, is that both main parties, and I'm going to speak now largely about the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, do take a slightly different ideological approach, for want of a better word, to this space. So if I just read you out a quote here. So when the Conservatives made their big announcement in Budget 2023 around this expansion of early years education and free hours, the budget statement says this, as in the announcement, will mean that parents will be empowered to work sooner to support their families and progress their careers. And later on, the budget document goes on to show government wants to ensure that working parents are not forced to reduce their hours because of children. In other words, for better or worse, the framing on the Conservative side is all around parents and parental hours and parental employment and childcare or early years education being used to support parental employment. If we look at the Labour Party documentation, by comparison, if we look at the Opportunity Mission document that was published, Labour say this: by ensuring families have early support, we can ensure every child has a firm foundation that sets them up in life. And later on, they talk about childcare as education. For Labour, childcare must be more than just a facility that allows parents to work more hours. It is about providing every child with the best start in life. Now, I don't make a judgment here as to whether one is better than the other, but it is interesting that despite the cross-party unanimity on the importance of this sector, the two main parties do take different approaches, and that would lend itself to, I think, different type of policy design. The third point I want to make is that despite the fact that there is unanimity around the fact that something needs to be done in this area, questions of implementation are really tricky. And we've seen only very, very recently the aforementioned Budget 2023 plan run into a bit of difficulty, he says with English understatement, around really basic things like, is there enough money? Are there enough people? And do we have an IT system underpinning it? You know, small things like that. And the fact that only a few weeks before the scheme is about to roll out, a lot of providers are saying, well, we don't know we're going to be doing it. We don't know how much we're going to be funded for it. We don't know how it's going to work. We don't have any people that can deliver it. We don't have an IT system that underpins it. These are complicated things. Well, on the one hand, they're very simple things, as in they should be sorted. On the other hand, they are very, very complicated things to get right. And simply saying warm words and indeed allocating quite a considerable sum of funding in the government's case towards this doesn't actually mean that something will happen. So one of the questions for this webinar, and one of the questions that Sutton Trust have asked about is, how do you make this stuff happen? Part of it, I'm afraid, is the deeply unsexy but important grind of implementation and making stuff happen. It's not simply enough to wave a big wand, get an amount of money out of the Treasury, and hey presto, we now suddenly have a rejuvenated and refreshed early years education sector. You actually have to make these things happen, and other people, I'm sure, will talk later about significant shortages in workforce and in skills of the workforce, and that absolutely has to be addressed as a priority. Because the risk is my fourth point. The risk is that if we get this wrong, three things could happen. The first is that we could end up with just a completely bodged system. We could end up with half the people getting 15 hours who are meant to get 30, half the people getting 30 hours, some people getting none of their extra hours. Even leaving aside the different eligibility criteria, just the actual simple fact of a postcode lottery being how well your council has managed to roll out these extra hours will end up with a slightly bodged system. Or we'll end up in a system potentially where gaps widen even further because of the fact that, as the Sutton Trust briefing talks about, eligibility is based on parental work status rather than child need, means that potentially we end up in a system where these extra hours widen gaps rather than narrow them. And the third potential option, and again, speaking now to the Labour Party potential policy on this around breakfast clubs, is that we end up with a quite small change that is insufficiently broad to take account of all the things that Labour wanted to do. So I think it is reasonably clear that Labour would like to make an even bigger, even more comprehensive offering around early years education that is framed, as I said from my quotes earlier, that is framed much more around childhood, early years. But at the moment, all they've actually committed to is universal breakfast clubs. Now, there's nothing wrong with universal breakfast clubs. They're a very good idea. They can deliver a number of benefits. But a huge amount of thing is being packed into these hypothetical breakfast clubs. So unless these hypothetical breakfast clubs are about 10 hours long and have highly skilled people in them, it is unclear to me at the moment that Labour will be able to do all the things they want to do, including such things as mandatory toothbrush, without having it. So there's my concluding remarks.
Well done, Jonathan. You got in there just before I was going to tell you to chop along. So well done. I'm appreciative. I'm going to go next to Laura Barbour. She's the early years lead at the Sutton Trust. Laura, if you'd just like to tell us a tiny bit about your role before you jump into your remarks, we'd appreciate it.
Yes. Yes, so I'm the early years lead at the Sutton Trust, which means that I work across all of the trust different areas. So I do action research, and then I also work on the policy and a more, reviewing based research work, but all leading on early. Yeah.
Fantastic. Do launch into your remarks.
Okay, thank you. So I think the evidence is clear that parents and carers play the most important role in a child's early development, but also high quality early education and care benefits all children, but particularly those from disadvantaged families. And as Jonathan has said, with the unprecedented public and political focus on this area, it really is an opportunity for the next government to support child development, close poverty-related attainment gaps, and support parents accessing work and training. But again, recent changes in the early years policy have actually shifted the balance from early education towards childcare. Now, this must be redressed, or we will see quantity of hours prioritised at the expense of quality of provision, and learning gaps between the children from the most and least well-off families risk widening. And I kind of find it frustrating to hear often that, oh, all children are going to be eligible for the planned expansion, when that is actually far from the case. The current 30 hours offer and planned expansion of state-funded hours is only for children whose parents meet certain work-based criteria. And this does risk excluding many children from the lowest income families. And this can be seen really very clearly in the data. Just 20% of families in the bottom third of earnings are currently eligible for the existing 30-hour offer at 3 and 4. 70% of those eligible for support are from homes in the top half of earners. And significantly, parents in full-time education or training are also excluded. Now, the planned expansion just risks exacerbating the situation because it applies a similar eligibility criteria. Now, there's already a gap in the achievement of a good level of development at the start of school between children eligible for free school meals and their peers, and this has been widening since 2017. So in 22-23, it was 20 percentage points. And this gap has been shown to potentially double by the end of primary school and then double again by the end of secondary school. So the early years really are a vital opportunity to stop this gap from forming. And as Jonathan said, the Labour Party have recognised the importance of childcare as education because it sets children up for school and life, and particularly affects children from low-income backgrounds. But we need to see this translate into a commitment to address this inequality in provision, in line, for example, with access at school age. So the Sutton Trust is calling for a rebalancing of entitlement so that all children, irrespective of their family's working status, have a core educational entitlement of at least 20 hours per week, first prioritising age 3 and 4, followed by the 2-year-olds. And then beyond this core, where extra provision is needed, it could be paid by parents on a sliding scale of fees by income level so that no family is excluded. Now, again, these dramatic policy changes are all happening within the context of providers already facing extreme workforce and capacity challenges, which I'm sure June will talk about. This is forcing many settings into decisions based on economics to ensure survival. For example, prioritising children eligible for the most funded hours, relying on financial add-ons from parents, and in the worst case, actually having to close settings in more disadvantaged areas. And of course, all these place poorer children at a further disadvantage. So an immediate measure would be, for example, to increase the early years pupil premium rate in line with schools, as it's only currently running at 25% of the primary school rate, and also to improve the cumbersome process of accessing the funds. That really needs to be streamlined. We could also ring fence the low income the funding that goes to low-income children through the national funding formula. And this needs to increase in line with the numbers of qualifying children, because rather than stagnating at 2017-18 levels, which has meant it's been spread much more thinly. But what is key is that access and quality for all children really must be developed in tandem. We had the Trust's world-class report recently highlighted really the clear risk if you have rapid expansion without focusing on quality. So the example was Quebec in the late 90s, which provided heavily subsidised places for all children, regardless of whether or not parents worked. But the initiative led to negative long-term impacts for many of the children because the rapid ramping up of provision without sufficient high-quality staff just led to reduced quality of provision. I mean, what's key is a skilled workforce with appropriate skills, knowledge, and qualifications support children's early learning and development. Now, this really is a sector which has the potential to attract some of the most passionate, skillful and committed workers, but low salaries and a lack of training and career opportunities are contributing to rapid staff turnover, and the proportion of unqualified staff working in the sector has risen. So in 2023, 1 in 5 were unqualified, up from 1 in 7 in 2018. And the proportion of staff with full and relevant level 3 qualifications, I think, has dropped since 2018. And to be honest, the effort to have a graduate leader in all settings has all but stalled. So there really does need to be an early years workforce strategy with minimum qualifications specified. And this has to be accompanied by adequate funding to attract and retain qualified staff and provide ongoing training. I mean, interestingly, the Irish government have recently announced plans to regulate minimum qualification levels of staff, and they've linked it to funding increases. I mean, a practical and immediate recommendation would be to would be to reintroduce. Sorry, I'm on echo. Would be to reintroduce a leadership quality fund to reward experience and qualifications. And in the first instance, this should be targeted at settings serving the most disadvantaged communities. And just finally, a very important point is that in the world-class report, family centres were identified as a common element in several countries with best practice. And in England, a government-commissioned report found evidence of the positive impact of attending children's centres on the home learning environment, physical and mental health, engagement with early education, and longer-term educational attainment. So the overall inclusion being that services provided good value for money. So given the evidence of the benefits, the next government should develop a national strategy supporting young families, either within the all-age model such as family hubs, or more specific to the younger age group with the original Sure Start model. And any national rollout really should, again, prioritise the more disadvantaged areas. The key is the next government must recognise the vital importance of combined services of support for children and their families, and develop a system where high quality early education and childcare are complementary. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Really, really appreciate that insight. And I think we will definitely want to come back to the kind of inequalities that already exist in the system and whether this is just going to bake them in even further. A woman who I'm always delighted to see on any panel because she brings such fantastic energy wherever she goes is Juno Sullivan, and she is the CEO at the Early Years Foundation, the London Early Years Foundation. Juno, are you with us?
I am. I was a bit late because the train from London to Manchester was running late today. It's like slightly hysterical, but I'm very glad to be here. I'm not sure how much I can add to these comments because in a way they've kind of captured everything. So I'm going to pick. There's sort of three sides to the triangle as far as I see it. There's the parent, the provider, and the child. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the child, if you don't mind, because I don't disagree with anything. And I was very pleased to hear Jonathan talk about the shift to the arm of the welfare state, which freaks me out, I have to say, when, because there's no real thinking about what that might mean. So we will oscillate from a mad market model to a mad welfare model, and nothing will probably work properly, which is why I'm a social enterprise, balancing the benefits of a business model with the social purpose of a charitable, I suppose, or a voluntary sector approach, and marrying the two together and actually having some business acumen, which is what's sadly lacking at the moment, I think, from the government's understanding of how a rollout needs to operate. So Laura has talked a lot about the disadvantage in terms of the eligibility crisis, and she's right. And what we're dealing with at the moment is an understanding or a perception that that children will be okay. It's not really true. We have kind of got people talking about what they might, I think, very unhelpfully describe as the COVID generation. Not helpful. But the truth is there is something in that. There is something significant in that, the number of children that we are now seeing in terms of disadvantage, but also in terms of SEND is quite significant. And like my team, I have 39 nurseries across 12 London boroughs. We have 4,500 children and over 900 staff. And consistently, they're saying to me, they don't even think about speech and language now. That's par for the course. What they're looking at are quite significant behavioural issues in the children. And I really think that the Labour Party is serious about inclusion and everything else. The first thing it needs to do is actually get a proper piece of research as to find out how much of that is myth, how much of that is real, what does it look like, and also just uncover stuff like, is it pollution? Is it chemicals? Is it all other things, not just simply this COVID thing? Because children were exhibiting some of those anxieties beforehand, and now they're certainly they've sort of ramped them up. So that'd be the first thing I'd say is, think about the children in this. The language of childcare and education is one that's been around for a while. It was interesting that the Early Years Coalition did a piece of research and found that parents aren't too comfortable with the word education and are still kind of quite comfortable with the childcare thing. And that probably takes you straight to staff, where the three reasons staff are really fed up is, one, the pay is. 2, and actually quite significant, is status. Really, really can't understand why people don't get what they do. And the ignorance is sort of laughable at times, I think. And then 3, I think Laura mentioned it, was CPD and a sense of career progression. At the same time, there was a very interesting piece of work done by the University of Leeds, which gave me great hope that 50% of the people who left the sector would come back if the circumstances were right. Now, I call them my boomerangs. So I've got quite a lot of boomerangs who go out and try something else and hate it and come back, or who've wanted actually to change their world and fallen in love with working with small children. I know that the DFE are launching their big campaign on the 1st of February, which I think is around the corner. And that'll be very interesting to see, because they got a decent film company to do it. And I think the DFE took ages to persuade the marketing department at the government to allow this to happen. So it's good that it is. And I'm hoping that that will sort of raise people's awareness. The Princess of Wales did quite a bit of awareness raising, but all she did was, in a way, depress us more by finding out that only 17% of the population actually understood what we do. So she got the figures, but they were not great. So there's some more work to do on that as well. So I think, and in terms of the staffing, I think the other thing that I'm very careful of is that there's an awful lot of negative language out there at the moment. And like, it's like, working with children, childcare, whatever language they use. It's terrible. They don't pay you. You work all day, and no one respects you. Well, tell me, if that was the narrative, who would want to come and work in a sector that's all they hear about? The truth is, when you actually ask the staff, they like working with children. They are interested in how children develop. They're interested in how they support their learning. They're interested in things like how they acquire language. Now, you're right that the level of quality is mind-boggling. I have no idea what's gone wrong, but the people are coming out to us from colleges and through the apprenticeship group. A lot of them, my gosh, before my staff said to me, oh, June, we wouldn't even shortlist them. Now we have to employ them. So there is a bit of an issue about where is quality got to, and what does that look like if you're really good at teaching? Because LEAF staff are all called LEAF teachers, LEAF early years teachers, because they understand there's an art, craft and science about early years teaching. It's not just a watered down primary school. And also it's very skilled. You have to be very skilled to understand child's play, because play is a very small word of a very big science. So I think there's something that we can do, that the Labour Party can do, would be to stop talking about breakfast clubs, because a decent breakfast club actually is part of a nursery, but to actually think about what we mean by early years education and support. What does that look like? Why would you want to work in there? And I think it was Jonathan who said, in the end, I think I wrote it down, in the end, it's painful and it's unpleasant, but it's actually about funds. You have to pay the money to actually get the thing to work. And to fix the budge system. I called that the other day. I was doing Women's Hour, and I told them, basically the sector doesn't want to look like a bunch of Egypts. I'm going to stop on that point, because I think that's what we don't want to. I think that's what we.
I mean, absolutely. No one wants to look like an Egypt. Definitely not people who are working themselves silly trying to look after the most youngest people in our society. I'm going to go last to Philippa Williams. She's the strategy director at Claremont, which is a strategic communications consultancy, and she's been working with the Early Education and Childcare Coalition, who I've worked a lot with, and I think have really shifted the debate in this area as well. Philippa.
Unmuted. I've got some slides to share, so please don't start my timer until I load them up. Is that all right? Okay. No, don't panic me. Hello, everybody. As I said, my name is Philippa Williams. I'm strategy director at Claremont. Over the last 12 months, I've had the absolute privilege of being able to work with the Early Education and Childcare Coalition. And today I'm going to share with you some of the work which actually June has just alluded to. Can everybody see that? Lexi, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Great, thank you. So for those of you who may not know the coalition, it's an organisation who brings together organisations who are all interested and focused on the need for rescue and reform within the sector, of which LEAF and the Sutton Trust belong. Our work with the coalition has been understanding public perceptions of the issue through quant and qualitative research, and then doing work around narrative and framing to get a sense of what are the issues and how do people think that they need to be solved. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about in our session. What I'm going to start with is the opportunity. So I think, as Jonathan mentioned up front, and as we all know, this is absolutely a pivotal moment for the sector. When we conducted quant work just after the government's spring budget announcement last year, what we saw is this kind of overwhelming support for the need for investment in early education and childcare, and in fact that it should be a focus of the government. And that absolutely played out in our core work of parents kind of desperate for help and support with costs. And for some, it is a voting issue. We saw just under half of people saying it was something that they would consider as being an issue at the next election. I've seen other work that says it's probably not in that kind of top 1, 2, 3 issues, but particularly for women, particularly for those who've got children who are, accessing at this age, it is a consideration, and it will probably also play out in people's concern about how they're managing their household budgets within a cost of living crisis. So why are people supportive? Well, fundamentally, the problem that they think we need to fix is about reducing cost. And that's really also, they will buy into the kind of economic argument. So helping people to get back to work, stimulating the economy by ensuring that there's more people and therefore hours within the system, as well as reducing the benefits bill. But as always, there is a nuance to that. So people believe that parents should be, if they can afford it, should be paying part of the bill alongside government. And there's also this general caution about a growing tax bill. And I think you'll see that across most policy issues, where there is suggestion of increased investment, people want to understand how it's going to pay for itself. So in terms of the question of who should benefit, as I think Jonathan talked about up front, the issue has very much been framed in that of work, and that is where people are kind of focused in terms of where the benefits should sit. So people who are in work, people who are struggling, people who need support to get back into work. And on the question of universal access, really the country is split between those who are supportive and those who are against. But what about the children? And this goes back, I think, to the quality argument that Laura's talking about up front. So what you can see from those initial stats is that the government has been successful in framing that narrative around one of work, one of parents, and one of the economy. So when you ask people who benefits from government reform in this area, 46% of people say parents, around 7% of people say young children. So we then did further research to try and understand when people talk about quality and when parents are speaking about and thinking about this issue, what really matters to them. And I think what we heard is probably what should have been intuitive, I guess, which is that when parents talk about the issue, it's their children that come first. It's not, the government might talk about work and they might talk about the economy, but for parents, they want to know that their children are going to be okay, their safety, their happiness, their well-being, and their development. And I think the other thing that we really saw within our work is what most people on this call will know and be seeing is that people are having it really tough. It's a really difficult climate at the moment. And so people are really struggling to make ends meet, and that leads to a sense of kind of resentment at how hard people are feeling they have to work just to kind of make things okay for their children and families. So, just to be able to put food on the table, pay their mortgage and their rent, to be able to pay for their fuel, their bills, their clothing, they kind of want more time with their children, but they're feeling that they have this kind of overarching pressure. And particularly those that we spoke to on universal credit had this sort of fear that with a focus in on, access to hours much earlier in their children's lives, this sort of sense of a pressure of having to get back to work, a pressure of having to seek work and all the stress that comes with that. And what impact would that have on their child and what impact would that have on them as parents? So it's kind of no surprise really that if parents can't be with their children, they want to make sure that their children are okay, that they are confident that their children are with people who care about them, who are going to nurture them, develop them, support them, keep them safe, and are going to be reliable so that they themselves can be reliable as workers. And although parents didn't use the word education in the work that we did, what we did hear is that people know that this is an important time within their children's lives, that it is an important time for their social and emotional development. It is a time where they can see that the building blocks of their future development are laid, and that they want their children to be known, they want their interests to be engaged with, they want them to come home joyous and happy at the end of the day. And of course, they frame that within their own experience. So the 5 minutes that they see at drop off and pick up, their interactions with their childminder or their key worker, the forms that they fill in at the end of the day. They want their role as parents to be protected, absolutely, but they also do see early education and childcare as having the potential to bring something different, not better, but different into their children's lives, and that collectively that can bring a kind of, can help to build the best start for their children. So I kind of, although I think the public perception work kind of does support the supposition of this webinar that the conversation is often too much about work economy and childcare, I think that there is an opportunity to open it up. I'll stop there because I think my time is almost up, Lexi, but there is so much more that I can talk about, including the work that June alluded to just there, which is around the kind of, what do people understand between the language of early education and childcare? It's not the same, through to attitudes to the workforce. Maybe we can pick up in the Q&A, or you can link in and email me if anyone's interested. Thank you. Thank you.
Well done, Philippa. I think you get top marks for being the most disciplined speaker that we'd had, because you were the only one who actually did keep it to 5 minutes. So well done. I'm going to launch into a kind of political policy question straight off the bat, because, we are looking at this through the lens of a general election. And Jonathan, if I could come to you, why do you think Labour are being so reticent on this issue? You mentioned the breakfast clubs, and if I hear any more references to the breakfast clubs coming out of the Labour shadow education team, I think I'll scream, because it seems to be the answer to all of our ills. Why do you think they're being so reticent, and have the Conservatives kind of already stole the thunder here, because they are actually the people, despite all of the faults that we've heard about, actually putting in this reform?
I wish I had a more complicated answer than because it's really expensive to do anything else. But because it's really expensive to do anything else. I think it's fairly clear from reading the rooms that the original plan from Labour a couple of years ago was to announce this sort of fully funded, at least 0 to 5 system, if not with an ambition to get to a sort of 0 to 11 system. So you'd have, almost universal 0 to 2 coverage, you'd have greater support 3 to 5, and then you'd have, before school clubs and after school clubs all the way through primary. I think that's the sort of, that has long been seen as the holy grail, particularly amongst those on a sort of, what you can just call for shorthand on the progressive side of politics. But it's really, really expensive, and it's really hard to do. And, I think both of those are legitimate challenges. And in fairness to Labour, they have not wanted to make a commitment which either they can't fund, or probably equally importantly, they don't think is deliverable. And even the Conservatives, pretty ambitious, but not as ambitious as that plans, are already rapidly running into the ground, as we've seen. What I would hope is that, because of the sort of the odd way in which the economics of politics works, which is that money is not money if your opponent's already committed to it, is that if there is a change of government after the next election, you essentially have the £4 billion that the Conservatives have committed to, but in practice, most of which will not have been spent because of the timescales. You could actually then take that money and slightly repurpose it towards a slightly different offer. But it's hard to do that now, because again, in this sort of slightly weird way that political economics works, then it looks like you're making an extra spending commitment, because the government will say, well, we've already spent that money. So if you want to spend that money, that's another £4 billion a year on top. Where's that money coming from? Of course, once you're in office, you can take the existing money and spend it in the way you want. So that is my guess as to where we'll end up. But this is a 10-year plan, if not a 15-year plan, rolling out some form of universal early years education system, complete with the workforce, complete with the regulations, complete with the quality, is not something which you can just snap your fingers and deliver. This is a seismic change to what the Department for Education currently does.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jonathan. I'm going to come to you, June, and talk, in Ireland, we saw that when there was a rollout of an entirely new childcare system, there was a huge amount of conversations and consultation between the sector who are, tasked with delivering the new system and the people in charge of making the policy. We didn't get that here. Is it possible for this system that, as it's being said by the government, is going to roll out, so the system that we're faced with, is it possible to make this system work, do you think, for the early years sector?
I think it is possible to phase it. So I think we could look at a phasing of it and doing it like the children in most need, phasing upwards. I mean, I think Laura will correct me on this, but I think the figures are about 70% of the universal access are families who are earning more than 50,000 or 45,000 a year. So if we were to phase it, we could possibly do something. Like the Irish have also connected with like there's requirements on them, you just can't like rock up. So there's quite a lot of tension as well, which we haven't talked about here, where a growing number of the services in the UK are funded by overseas private equity companies. And, there's probably a question to be asked, is this where our taxpayers' money should be going, paying a dividend, or should we be supporting the majority of the sector, which is small standalone nurseries, probably running on, on a shoestring, who have got who are sort of like what they might call mamas and papas. So there's some big questions to be asked about the rights of, where does taxpayer money go? And if it does, who is it targeted at? And if we're going to phase this in, then how would we do that so that actually people had some stage? But at the moment, just let it be clear, there's probably not, it's not going to happen because we have no places. The children who are 2-year-olds are already in the places. We haven't got enough staff, and I'm not going to kill my staff for this because they already have worked very hard all through COVID and have continued to do so. And what we see is, the only thing a staff member will often ask for, and this is kind of this makes you think, is can I go home on time? Because your great staff, your experienced staff, you tend to keep them on doing the extra. So your junior staff or your newer staff, you keep them in the day when they're, when you can keep an eye on them. So who's opening and who's closing, who's there at the end of the day to support the parents and stuff, you tend to keep your experienced staff. And all they often want to do is go home. So why would you, for no extra money, really, because the 3- and 4-year-old uplift is not one, there's no uplift for the disadvantaged 2-year-old, why would you put your organisation at risk, put your staff in a precarious position, and possibly undermine what you currently offer to the small children that you currently have for an unsecured, unsupported, badly thought out expansion plan?
I mean, I think your point about the privatization of the sector is a really valid one, because what we have here is a huge influx of state funded demand, but no kind of regulation really, and no oversight of who's coming in to provide it. And that goes back to Laura's point about quality. It speaks to everything that you've said. Laura, do you think that privatization is a particular risk to people from underprivileged backgrounds?
I think the risk is that you have a kind of a two-tier system whereby the kind of private providers that June mentions in particular end up going to kind of more affluent areas where they're able to recruit families who might be able to pay additional fees, and that's not the issue. And I think the settings which are providing for families where they're just eligible for the funded fees, and that's all they're going to funded hours, and that's all they're going to pay. I think that is going to be a problem, and I think that's something, in fact, that's already happening, where you've got areas where you've got kind of childcare setting deserts because the settings aren't able to make ends meet. As I kind of mentioned before, because they can't charge any additional fees, and it's just they aren't getting enough to able to survive. So yes, I think that and the more I guess the risk, the more the kind of private providers that you mentioned kind of become dominant, then you're going to have less people who are kind of providing the kind of service where they are. For example, someone like June's Leaf, they make sure that they include children who who wouldn't normally be eligible because they do separate fundraising. So, you know, their whole kind of mode of operation is to make sure that, you know, they have a kind of social mix, but, you know, they're not thinking just about the bottom line.
35% of our places.
35% of our places just
Laura, this is a question from the audience here. We've talked about people who are from backgrounds of low earning backgrounds, but there's also an issue of children who have parents who have migrated to this country who have been locked out of childcare. What do you think is the best way? What does the panel think is the best way to ensure that all families living in the UK can access early years education, regardless of their parents' immigration status?
I mean, on that, I mean, I'm not going to talk specifically on the immigration status, but I do think it just makes total sense to treat them the same as any family, and just look at it in terms of need and then in terms of income level. So, you know, and include them on that basis. I mean, one of the things that we've suggested is a potential sliding scale so that, you know, no one is excluded. But, you know, we would be wanting to see everyone included on basis of need, not on basis of either their status or their income levels, or work levels.
So sorry. I'd be interested to get Philippa's thoughts on this, as perhaps June as well. Interest from members of the audience, and I'm certainly very interested in this idea of status and perception of the early years workforce. I mean, I talk to workers in this industry all of the time, and I think one of the status issue is so important. It's almost as important as pay for many workers. You know, how do we increase that status? Is the easiest way of doing it by increasing pay? The Department of Education have promised a kind of comms campaign to draw people into the sector. Philippa, do you think that can work?
I think well, I think it's probably how good's the comms campaign would be my first question, but I think so I think the question of status is really interesting, and I think it's quite nuanced. The first thing that I would say is that in all the work that we've done, there is a sort of acceptance, particularly in the kind of general public, that that this is a challenging job and that people are kind of doing their best and they're under pressure. I think the other thing that we saw that was really interesting is that particularly for those kind of working parents who are paying significant fees, they do often see the relationship as almost like a service, so that they're paying for, and that has quite interesting connotations, I think, therefore, in terms of how they interact with and respect and trust those that they're working with. That said, the relationship between the key worker and the individual parent and their child, I think, is in our work has kind of been respected and seen as incredibly important. And so therefore any risk to, you know, retention or consistency is seen by parents to be really worrying and concerning. So I think that's a kind of core territory that you could work within and around. I think that
I'm just going to bring in, can I just interrupt you for a second? I just want to bring in June there and say, June, you know, you work, you have these people like absolute heroes working for you all the time. How can, as a workforce, how can people working in the early years kind of, what can they do to increase their own status and, you know, push for better funding, better paying conditions? I mean, I recently wrote a story about some early years workers who tried to unionize in Knowsley, and the moment that they tried to unionize, they were all promptly sacked. So what's the way forward in just a sentence or two, June?
I mean, we'll never get the funding. We'll never pay the staff more unless we get the funding right. That's the starting point, because most of your costs, 72 to 75% of your costs are staff costs. So that's where that goes. The second thing is, I think there is an opportunity for a big campaign, and I'm pleased that the DFE are doing one right now. But it's about making people understand what we do. And I think that those conversations are really powerful. Nobody queries what a primary school teacher does, but they all ask what what happens during the day. And I think that's significant. And I think the other thing is, we were often shot down for talking about the language of pedagogy, but I never stopped talking about that. It'll be on my epitaph when I die. But, the pedagogy is hugely important, because if you don't respect the fact that there's a way that you should teach, and there's a way children learn, and there's a way that you deliver the a curriculum, and, in terms of its art and science, then I think those kind of language are really powerful. So I think there's much to do about that, but I think it's also about people being ambassadors. What happens is they're all your ambassador while the children are in the nursery and the second child comes. But once they leave, that part of your life is over and stuff. But what you want as parents to go away, to continue to want to say, well, this was very important for my child. And some great sort of longitudinal studies. We've only really got one serious longitudinal study, and that's the EPI study. And I think maybe we should do some more from like a comms, more of a experiential rather than an actual, academic piece. And I don't, in a sense, it's like a storytelling. We need much more storytelling, I think, that captures the science and the research in the stories. You can do that really nicely without it having to be all academic or all policy. You can actually marry the two together. And I think that's probably what's missing, because ultimately what we have to do, and people quote Europe all the time, the difference between Europe and us is simply that we haven't accepted the culture that actually it's okay if some children go to nursery. So we still have to have those public debates about, most parents love their children. They don't want anything bad to happen to them. It's okay to stay at home with your child if you want to, if you can. I think we need much more of that conversation. At the moment, it becomes very sort of binary. You go to work, you drop your child in a nursery. What if you don't want to? And then if the Labour Party is serious and they think the way in is to just fill up the schools where the demography is changing, what about the under twos? Then you would then really damage the sector, because then you would split out. And Ofsted will tell you that when we get outstanding Ofsteds, and we've got 50% of ours are at that stage, then actually what they say is they love what they see in the baby room that filters into the toddler room, that filters into the preschoolers. They can see the learning that started down there, the language, the setting of the seeds. So the idea that somehow or other you can kind of just stick your 2-year-olds into the school classrooms because they have space isn't probably a conversation that's going to drive a culture where the entire public is behind you, because they want their children to actually do well. And when they say, I have no child, it's nothing to do with me, you say, well, actually, this child is going to be paying tax in 15, 20 years, which is going to support you when you're old and ill. So actually, it's everyone's child.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a debate that we need to all feel invested in this, don't we? And it's difficult to do that without universality. And quite a few of our listeners who, by the way, are sending in the most incredible questions that we could speak about this all day. There's a few questions here about the provision of special educational needs. Lucy Stevens asking how they're served within the current system and how politically salient the group is. And also Joe Evans from Dingley's Promise saying, we're seeing families turned away who have got SEND needs. How can we make sure that this group is just not abandoned and forgotten? I don't know who might be best to answer that.
The business of turning children. Sorry, go on.
No, go on, June. But
very quickly, of turning children away is she's right. It's becoming more of an issue. In some of my nurseries, over half our children have got SEND. That it was with no support. It's all early intervention, not a sign of CAMS, not a sign of a health visitor, not a sign of a speech and language therapist. So the team are trying to manage that. When you have numbers as high as that, it's impossible. Even if you want to take the children, you simply can't. So I think there's a whole issue about the SEND is what I said in my original point. We really need to step back and really do some proper research, not get emotive about it, but actually understand what the reality is.
Yeah, I mean, just to come in on that one, of course, on this, parents, as Philippa said, parents want to feel confident that they're getting the appropriate support. And this goes, particularly if a child, has SEN. So, and, therefore, again, it goes back to the point of quality. We have got to invest in quality. I mean, with the current situation, there's also, I mean, June will know this, maintained nursery settings get additional funding in order to be able to support families in this way. But, every year they have to reapply for the additional grant. So again, that's something they're working in an uncertain world too. But they do get additional funding in order to enable them to be able to provide support for SEN families.
And it's worth just saying that in our original polling, what we saw was about 20% of people were supportive of policy making being focused on ensuring that there was, quality provision for children with SEN and other needs. So I think that there is probably a kind of public understanding that could be built upon and kind of maximised in that area.
And just what came out from a lot of our case studies is particularly children who are kind of so young that they hadn't yet been diagnosed, and yet their families were finding that they had what they could see that they had additional needs, and they weren't able to access the support through an early education setting because they weren't eligible. Because one example of a parent we spoke to was that, she didn't feel she was able to work because she felt she needed to support her child. And then, she felt her child would really benefit from attending a setting just for, a few hours a week, socializing with other children, and they couldn't access that. So you had a kind of cycle there as well.
We're getting close to the end here. So I'm going to pick a really excellent kind of overarching question from a listener called Christine Pascal. Given the need to be realistic yet ambitious, if you were developing the phased approach to changing the sector, where would you start and why? I'm only going to give you one sentence. So what is your top wish for right now? If you could change one thing right now, what would it be? And I'll go to Jonathan first.
I would make a reality of the early years workforce strategy. Unless you get that proper training, regulation, a core curriculum that all early years practitioners needed to do, embedded in what we know about pedagogy of early years. Unless you get that, then we've got nothing else.
Yeah, we keep hearing a lot about workforce strategy and not seeing very much evidence of it, don't we? Laura, do you want to give your one way?
Yeah, a very pragmatic approach would be to reintroduce the Leadership Quality Fund to be targeted in particularly disadvantaged areas.
Well, that was excellently very nice and tight. Well done, Philippa.
I'm going to stay in my lane and say a comms thing, which I think I would focus in on some work around simplifying the offer and providing parents with greater understanding of what the offer is, how settings are funded, and therefore helping them to understand this kind of false dichotomy around cost and the hours they have. And therefore, I think that will build you a better understanding of quality overall.
And June?
I would have a Secretary of State for Children and ensure that all policies across the piece are filtered through the lens of what's good for children and how will it make their lives better.
Fantastic. I mean, we have tons of questions here that we won't get over to. I particularly have a lot of sympathy for the attendee who's asked about Northern Ireland, which of course isn't seeing any of the benefits of this and none of the rollouts, and is generally just being ignored. And there could probably be a whole webinar just about that. I am particularly interested in it. If you want to get in touch with me directly, do email me, find me on Twitter. I'm going to wrap us up here, and I think that we can all there's been such fantastic comments made on both on the questions and from our panel here. We all know, I think it's very clear that this is a momentous year in terms of early years. And we were all waiting slightly with some trepidation about what's going to happen in April and then again in September. It's interesting because we're at a time, aren't we, where something momentous is happening, and everyone who works in this sector who really cares about it is like, yes, fantastic. People are talking about early years. People are talking about childcare. People are talking about the education of the youngest people in society. But please, can we do it properly? Can we listen to the people who have that expertise? So that's why these panels like this are incredibly useful, because they're a sharing of ideas. But also everybody who's on this call who cares enough to give an hour of their day to think about this and talk about this, you just have to keep going. You have to keep up the work, and you have to keep lobbying, because the time is now. I don't want to be hosting a webinar in 7 years, 10 years time where we talk about how disastrously wrong this all went. The opportunity, I hope you agree, is still there for the time being. I'm going to wrap up there a whole 3 minutes early, because I know that people enjoy webinars ending on time. I'd like to thank our excellent panelists today, Jonathan Simons, Laura Barber, June O'Sullivan, and Philippa Williams. And I'd like to thank every single person who attended today. It was a pleasure to be your host, and let's keep that conversation going. Thanks all so much for your time.